Welcome to the second video in this 4-part series, Estimating Feed Supply. We need to understand how much forage there is and how much of that is available to livestock. We estimate the amount of unpalatable feed, leaf fall or detachment, and the amount we want to leave behind. Then we subtract these from the total. The standard is used to measure feedstuff, whether livestock are eating feedlot rations or pastures. This standard is the weight of dry feed. For pasture, we measure in kilograms per hectare of dry matter.
When we're working out a forage budget, it's about how much pasture there is in the paddock and how much the cattle are going to need. We need to take certain things out of the equation. So we work out the total yield first, and we do that by estimating or cutting some quadrats, and then we subtract the unpalatable, what is going to be detached or trampled by stock, and also we take out residual pasture. So that's what we want to be left at the end of the grazing period, which might be by Christmas time or perhaps early January. So the first thing we need to do as part of a forage budget is to work out actually how much pasture we have in the paddock. And we can do that by using these photo standards and look at the photos and roughly line them up with what's in the paddock. So in this paddock, we'd be looking across the pasture and comparing what we can see with what we can see in the photos. In this instance, the top photo shows us 1,800 kilograms per hectare of pasture, and the next one shows us 2,430. And in my estimation, what we can see here is much closer to the 2,400. But we find that when people use the photo standards and they haven't done any cutting, that in fact they often overestimate how much pasture is there. So it's advisable to do some cuts to get your eye in, and then you can use the photo standards from there on. I have the equipment here, necessary equipment to do our cuts. I've got some paper bags, a quadrat and a set of shears. You can use secateurs if you haven't got shears, but we would probably cut 3 to 5 quadrats in this area to work out what the pasture yield actually is. So what I do is find something on the horizon like a tree, step out every 5 or 10 metres and cut a quadrat. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to cut a quadrat after 5 metres. So I'll pick out that tree on the horizon over there, and we're going to go 5 paces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I put the quadrat down. It's at the point of my toe, so I don't bias where I actually select that quadrat. If I wanted there to be a high yield, I might take this quadrat and on the 5th step go, there's a nice big tussock, we'll choose that one. But we can't do that. We want it to be an honest reflection of what's in the paddock. So now we have the quadrat placed down. We need to put into the quadrat the grass that's actually attached and shooting up from in the base of the plant from in the quadrat itself. Everything that's in the quadrat right down to ground level. So within about 1 or 2 centimetres of ground level. What we're taking here is all plant material that's attached to a living plant base. That includes all this dead material, but we'll take that out later on. Some of this pasture material you can see is very old and it's going to be quite unpalatable. We'll take that out of the equation later on. Put it in the paper bag. So having cut the pasture, we need to weigh it to work out what the dry matter content is. And we need a set of scales. These are just ordinary kitchen scales, so you can steal them from the kitchen at home. They just need to weigh to about 1 or 2 grams to do that. And the first thing I need to do is to actually tear the scales to the bag weight. So we're not including the bag in the weight of the weight of the pasture as well. So we tear that off, and then we weigh the pasture, the bag with the pasture in it, and write that down. So in this case it weighs 102 grams. Now don't forget that what we have here is pasture that still has moisture in it. We need to dry that later on and get an estimate of what the dry matter content of the pasture is. And here's a little key for you to work that out in the paddock. I can estimate roughly what the dry matter content of this pasture is by comparing it with hay. Hay is about 85% dry matter, and what we've got in the paddock here is probably ready to bale, so that would be my estimate of the dry matter content of this pasture. So when we're working out how much pasture is in a paddock, it can be easy in uniform pastures like Mitchell grass pastures to do a transect and do 3 to 5 cuts along a transect at regular intervals, and that'll give a pretty good indication of how much pasture is actually in that part of the paddock. But most paddocks are patchy, so they'll have some areas that have high yielding pastures and other areas that have lower yielding pastures, and in fact some areas that cattle can't access because of distance to water, or perhaps it's a jump up and cattle don't go there, can't access it anyway, and other areas of the paddock that are lower yielding. So we need to take that into account in our estimation of how much pasture is actually in the paddock, and we use an accessible yield calculator to work that out. So in this part of the paddock we're going to need another couple of cuts to give us an idea of what the pasture yield is here. It's much lower here, there's less for them to eat in terms of the species that are edible as well, so we need to bring that into play as well. Whereas over here on the higher ground we've got Mitchell grass country, and the pasture yield is much higher. So we need to work out what proportion of the paddock has low yielding pastures, what proportion of the paddock has high yielding pastures, and what proportion of the paddock cattle can't access. In our estimation of pasture yield we can take browse into account too. In the dry season, when pasture quality is particularly low, cattle and sheep and goats in particular will graze a lot of browse. There'll be a high proportion of browse in their diet. Things like the blue bush we have here are highly digestible, high protein, and quite valuable components of the diet. So we can take those into account as well. And the way we would do that is to actually increase the estimate of the palatable pasture by another 10%. Mulga is another example of a browse species, and we do the same there. But when we've got things like lignum over here, they're actually not selected for, so we don't take them into account. So once we've got that, we've also got to take into account the unpalatable stuff. So the first thing is that carryover material from the previous season's growth that's gone grey. They're never going to graze that, and it's this stuff down here, all that grey material. It looks a bit like the litter that we have down here. Stock aren't going to eat that. So we need to take that out of the equation as well and estimate what proportion of the pasture is made up of that old grey and unpalatable material. The other thing we need to take into account are the unpalatable species, such as feathertop wiregrass. They seldom graze feathertop. Wiregrass is in another part of the state, they seldom graze. So we need to get a bit of a handle on that too. So what proportion of this paddock or this area is made up of wiregrass, what proportion of the yield. And my assessment here is there's not much, so it's only going to be about 5% in this case. In many other cases it can be as high, if you go into spinifex country, unpalatable can be as high as 75% or even more. So that definitely needs to be taken into account. So the next thing we need to take into account is detachment. So that's the pasture material that's either falls off during the dry months or that is trampled by cattle. Usually we work on 15% detachment. When there are a lot of annuals, that might go a lot higher. If you have intensive rotational grazing systems, detachment can get up to as high as 30 to 40%. Now when you have a lot of annual species, Flinders grass is a good example, there's going to be a greater amount of detachment. The issue we have with annual grasses like Flinders grass is that once they get to this stage, they're easily knocked to the ground, they disintegrate during winter, and we can end up before springtime without any grass at all on the ground for cattle. But once they get to this stage, they've seeded and they're basically dying, their quality drops off markedly. Cattle won't select them as much as they'll select green out of the pasture. We take detachment out of available feed in the forage budget because with stock moving through it, there's shattering and trampling of the feed, so it's not available for stock to use. Particularly with Flinders grass, when it comes to the months of August and September, high winds can actually shatter the grass as well, and it blows it away. That's why our perennial grasses are so important. Things like Mitchell grass and our bluegrasses. They're the ones we need to maintain to help our stock get through the winters with plenty of feed available. Now we need that residual pasture there to act as ground cover. So when we get our first summer storms, we're going to have plenty of ground cover and not lose all our soil. In most pastures, we need to have a minimum of about 1,000 to 1,200 kilos per hectare of residual to prevent erosion. So looking at this pasture, you can see that some of it has been grazed, and that's the sort of ground cover that we'd be wanting to have. In Mitchell grass country, we'd want a minimum of 30 to 40% ground cover. In other parts of Queensland, some of the sloping country might require 60 to 70% ground cover to ensure there's no runoff.
Estimating the forage supply requires a few simple steps to get it right. First, you estimate the total pasture in the paddock using photos as a guide or cutting and weighing samples. Then you subtract what cattle won't be able to eat, the unpalatable plants, and what will be lost as detachment over the time the stock will be grazing. Finally, you subtract the amount you want left behind to protect the soil, allow the pasture to quickly respond to rain, and for the next round of grazing. Watch the other videos in this series to learn about estimating livestock demand and calculating a feed budget.